Welcome everyone to We Need to Name This, where we unpack the hidden curriculum of academia with scholars of color. I'm Ebony Pruce, and this is my co-host,
Laura Ann Jacobs.
And today's episode is entitled Finding Funding. You like that alliteration we got going on? Okay. But first, we would like to introduce an amazing Black man and scholar, Charles Wilkes. He's going to share his experiences with us. But first, I'd like to tell you a bit about him. Charles Wilkes is a doctoral candidate at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in Educational Studies, Mathematics Education Program. He earned his BS degree from Morehouse College and an MAT at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He is a Gates Millennium Scholar, Ford Foundation Pre-Doctoral Fellow, and NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program Pre-Doctoral Fellow. His work focuses on understanding and capturing the experiences of Black learners in mathematics classrooms, particularly around smartness and being doers of mathematics. Another strand of his work investigates teacher practices, including how teachers build one-on-one relationships with students and the messages their practice communicates to their learners. So we want to thank you, Charles, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. All right, so we're going to start with your story. So you have a pretty unique story. You entered your PhD program right after completing your undergraduate degree, right?
Right.
We want to know a bit about what influenced your decision to apply to graduate school and how you got here.
Got you. Thank you for that question. So yeah, I was a baby when I came into the PhD program, but in so many ways, I think me kind of being in this program was a part of my trajectory, even going all the way back to high school. And so when I was in high school, I graduated when I was 16, but there was a gentleman there who passed away. His name was Dr. Michael Webb, who I had a conversation with. Through that conversation, he had told me to do a couple of different things, which include apply for the Gates Millennium Scholarship. And so I was fortunate enough to win the Gates Millennium Scholarship back in 2009. And so with that scholarship, for those of you who don't know, you get 10 years of funding. So you get up to 5 years for undergrad, you get 2 years for a master's, and you get 4 years for a PhD. And, I think just even getting that scholarship kind of already planted a seed that, graduate school will be a possibility in my future. Once I got to Morehouse College, loved it, was able to connect with several different people, faculty, my big brother, so classmates. And I was able to be a part of a program called the Ronald A. McNair program. And really that program, I think, was the next step in the trajectory that really prepared me for graduate school. The Ronald A. McNair program, the first summer I did it, I did research at Morehouse where I was doing math research with my advisor. And then the following summer, I was able to do research at Vanderbilt University, which was the first time that I actually had done mathematics education research. And so at an institution like Morehouse, you typically, there's a couple of things. There's not a math education program, so I was a math major, but there's always like a push in terms of like going to graduate school, whether that be, if you was a business major, going to get, MBA, if you were, trying to get a law degree, med school, it was just always kind of pushed. So in general, that idea was pushed. And I think being in a program such as the Ronald A. McNair program also kind of like really pushed me in the direction that I applied for graduate school. And so for me, it was like non-negotiable. Like I knew when I graduated, I knew I was going to somebody's graduate school. You go through the different seminars and you're working on your research statements. You had GRE prep and all of that. And so for me, I guess now I'm thinking about it and reflecting on it. It was something that slowly but surely kind of built in my trajectory along the way that kind of like pushed me into being in graduate school. I can't say it's something that I knew automatically or anything. I just think I was fortunate to be in some situations and be blessed with some funding and some opportunities that kind of continued to steer me along with some interests and passions that I think just, all of that kind of happened at the same time.
Cool. So you talked about a few different programs. I'm going to hold off on that and let Laura Ann ask you some questions. And when we get into just asking specifics about the programs, I'm going to bring up these two programs, the Gates Millennium Scholarship and the McNair program a little later in our conversation.
Okay. Perfect.
Thank you
Call
so
me
much
out on if I'm giving you any acronyms as well. I'm sorry. I'm saying I different programs and I'm not probably giving enough feedback. So just mental note.
No worries. We got to ask you.
That would get you. So Okay, so the topic of this episode is finding funding, and I heard you say like Gates Millennial Scholarship, and like we hear these terms like scholarship, fellowship, funding, and so I was wondering if you could just speak to what that term funding means, and why should a graduate student apply for funding? Like, why is that an
Mhm.
important part of this journey?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think for me, I'm gonna say it for me in general, and I'm gonna kind of spread it out. I think as a graduate student, there's several different reasons as to why you apply for funding. I think one, especially if the goal is to go in the academy, applying for funding, very early on allows you to put you in a position to apply for different things and kind of build up the CV. So there's typically one of the things when you're in graduate school and then you apply for faculty positions or postdocs is people want to see, like, do you have a history of like being able to get funding? And so funding in one capacity serves as an opportunity to show that I have ideas that I can apply, and people think these ideas are important in my field, and so I can get funding for such. Another reason I think funding is important, and I think some of this is just because there's so much variation across graduate school programs. And personally for me is I typically use funding as an opportunity to get feedback. When you're applying for these different funding outlets, there's a lot of things you have to do. You have to have your research statement, you have to have plans, you have to have all these different documents that you may or may not develop or get the opportunity to develop in your coursework or in other avenues in your program. Again, it varies a lot. I mean, some people may, but a lot. I know for me, that's not necessarily my experience. And so when you're applying for these positions, it allows you to see, like, well, what are the documents that I actually, I need to be thinking about and creating that, I might not otherwise have an opportunity to be able to apply for. And then second, again, it allows you to get that feedback. And so when you're applying for funding, you have the process typically goes, you send in your materials, and then there's several different rounds of people reviewing the application and then deciding, whether or not you get the fellowship or you get whatever the funding source is. And for me, I like that process to kind of see, again, these are my ideas. This is what I'm thinking about. What do other people in the field think about, what I'm trying to bring to the table? And a lot of times too, those fellowships, they do provide you feedback on your ideas and your overall application. And so I think at the very least, those are at least, two reasons why one in graduate school might consider applying. And I tell people, and this probably is also from a place of privilege, like, you also could apply for funding because you need funding. Let's just be clear. Like, we're in the pandemic now, and hopefully it'll be over soon, but every program is different. And so sometimes you need to apply for these fundings because of whatever is going on. So you actually need the money. But one of the things that I tried to do when I was applying, and I know it sounds cheesy, but I genuinely, when I was applying for funding, and most times when I apply for funding, I don't really care about the money as much as I really care about, like, the opportunity, and kind of going back to, again, developing materials, having an opportunity to get feedback, being in a network. Like, what is the outcome of these things? Having, responsibility and being able to be accountable to, because when you're applying for these things too, it's not like they just give you, the funding, that's it. Typically, you need to write reports. There's like expectations of, what are you doing year to year? Are you presenting? Are you trying to publish? Or, like, are you developing as a scholar? So there's also these other things that comes along with it. But I think those are at least a couple reasons why I think as a graduate student, you should consider applying. And regardless if you need funding or not, I think every graduate student to some degree should be applying for something. I don't think there's like a age or year thing on it. I think when I applied for some of the ones that I mentioned, I think I was in my second year. So yeah, that's kind of like my view about applying. And somebody once said, if you ain't getting rejected enough, you're not applying enough. So just continue to apply.
Some hopeful words. I have to try to internalize those a little bit more. One of the last things you said is, like, some of them you apply for your second year. So, like, some people that may be thinking about applying to graduate school and are like, I'm hearing Charles talk about, how you have to write this research proposal. And I know I'll go to graduate school, but I don't know what I'm going to research. I don't have any questions. I don't really know all the way what a methodology is yet. So I shouldn't go because I'll never get funded. Like, there are opportunities, like, each step along the way is what I hear you saying.
Yeah, and I'm happy you bring that up. And I'm gonna be very informal. I think you really have to shoot your shot. I think when I was applying, I was really in the same position that you were just talking about. I didn't feel very, confident in the methodology and things like that. But and again, and I know we're gonna come back to it later. It's crazy now, kind of like having this conversation. It's like everything happens for a reason and lines up. Like even knowing about some of these fellowships came from just my prior networks, and people was like, "Oh, now you're in graduate school, you need to be applying for these things," and even having people on campus that had applied for some of these things, and was willing to reach out. Like there's a couple people of mine and Kimka and Natasha who, when I was going through this process of applying for the Ford and NSF, were right there, and they weren't in my field, but just seeing them, being able to touch them and encourage each other to say like, man, you can apply for this. Like, if you need to meet, if I need to look over materials. So I just say that to say too, like we all have our own insecurities about where we are, with our work and our ideas and what we feel like we can do or what we haven't yet learned. But, I think again, I also see when you're applying for these things as the opportunity to just shoot your shot, see what happens. I mean, it's easier said than done, but I mean, the worst thing that can happen is you don't get the funding. But I think really the experience of applying for funding really far outweighs the outcome of it. And I say that, as a person who's applied for, a lot of different things, I really do find value in applying for things just to, kind of get the monkey off your back and get your feet wet.
Yeah, thanks. I heard you also say you did say NSF. I'm doing Ed's job now. But the Ford Fellowship, NF, these things, and so you're a doctoral candidate at the University of Michigan, and those fellowships are not University of Michigan
Mm-hmm.
fellowships, right? Those are like national fellowships. So there's some that are in
Federal funding.
organizations,
Mm-hmm.
some that are internal, external. Like what when we hear those terms, what does that mean?
Yeah, so for me, there's a couple things that come out when you hear those terms. So when you hear like an NSF or a Ford, you thinking academia, you thinking career wise. Like these are typically the organizations that also fund other types of things. So they typically fund. So as like for example, Ford not only has a pre-doc, but they have dissertation, they have postdocs, there's like a trajectory of different things that they apply that you could apply for and get. I didn't get Spencer or anything like that, but there's also other organizations such as Spencer that provides grants. And so when you're hearing like those names, you're thinking of the types of organizations that people apply for in academia, even post, graduate school. Now, internally, when I hear about different fundings, is those typically is a smaller pot of funding, and it looks a little bit different. I've also been able to apply for things internally as well, and that's worked out too and won different awards. Um, I guess you could say when you think about some of the other federal funding, they might hold more weight, but I still think that applying for internal things is as important or just as important as well. Because again, the goal, if you're thinking about applying and we're thinking about going to academia, then you want to continue to build up this skill of continuing to apply almost like a muscle. And so it never hurts to continue to be applying for different things, especially if you need it. And so even internal funding, such as things that are often offered to us as graduate students that, typically if you just apply for, you would get, but sometimes we don't even apply for either we don't know or, we don't see it as like a big deal. But I think, when I'm applying for anything, I kind of view it as a big deal, whether it's the small education grants or if it's something like a pre-candidate funding that we offer that's offered in Michigan or your candidate funding that's offered. I think all of the different fundings matter, but typically that's how, when you hear those names, that's that's how you associate them. The ones that I just mentioned, like the NSFs and Fords, have more. They typically offer more, and they're more prestigious and typically have a little bit more longevity. And then the ones inside the institution are more catered towards us, and one could say they might be easier to get depending on what it is, but definitely are opportunities to continue to build out. I mean, there's even smaller things like, travel grants and things like that. Like the way I see it, even going back to high school, every dollar count, every cent count. And so, as long as you're using it to grow and develop as a scholar, don't really put, a price on it. Because again, for me, it's been really all about the experience.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing about those distinctions. I hear like how much, you know, you got to prioritize external funding. It's like, what is that? I got like $500 from this like grant from my school. Is that good? And it's like, no, that's not what they're looking for. So, so I appreciate you clarifying that. I'm gonna pass it over to Ebony for a few questions.
Got you. Thank you for those questions.
Yeah, listening to you two, it made me think like I wish someone had told me when I was applying or after I applied how important it is to procure funding for like your future, like to look at your resume, right, or your CV, right?
Mhm.
That folks want to know that you can like get money, right?
Right.
It's important. I just want to put a little pin in that, right?
Right.
Well, it depends on the kind of university you want to go to. So if you're trying to go to a Research One university,
Right.
you're like on top of the like getting the grants and things like that. But if you're going to more of like a teaching college or teaching school, you know, it's good to get funding, but that's not going to be the number one priority when they look at your CV. So I think it's important to make that distinction because like, for example, I'm not teaching at a Research One university. And so it's cool not to like have to be like, oh, well, I didn't get any money all this time. I got some money when I got into school, but I didn't really.
Right.
But it's a skill that I really wish I had, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, like if I knew that that was something that would make my CV look good, I would have done it anyway, regardless of what institution I was trying to go to. And so I'm glad that you shared that because I don't think many people know that you should.
Right.
That even before you get into grad school or while you're in grad school, you should be doing that throughout, even if you get rejected, to keep going. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think I appreciate you for revoicing that too. Because even as I was mentioning, I was probably I was implicit in probably favoring like the research side. Also, when I'm thinking about grants and funding too, like it's things that even relate to teaching. Like, you know, there's grants to be able to design a course, which in hindsight, you might think, well, that's not research based, but if that's a course that only you can teach, right? And then you get into, you get into the job market, hint, hint, wink, wink, but you get into the market, it wasn't research, but now you have an asset because you apply for this funding and it wasn't research based per se, but it did support you in your own personal development. And so just thinking about it, not even just in terms of research, but like other more broadly, like your development as a scholar, as a teacher, as a researcher, I think that's important to highlight. And we kind of, skip over that from time to time as well. I'm just happy that you also revoiced that because I didn't want it to come off as favoring like only be applying for the research stuff. Like, no, I'm saying get in the habit of applying for things in general because that is a skill and a muscle. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to be able to use some of those resources that you develop anyway, again, to be recycled, or they could be, the foundation for something else moving forward.
Makes sense. All right. So you told us a bit about, well, you and Laura Ann out here just throwing out fellowship names and all this stuff, right? So we're going to get into some more specifics around those things. I think, like you mentioned before, you mentioned NSF. You also mentioned those are examples of external funding, like Laura Ann was saying. Internal funding would be, if you get your candidacy grant at your university or your pre-candidacy grant, and Laura Ann and I will explain those things in another episode.
Right.
But, so the internal and external piece, those application processes are different, right? Some are more extensive than others. I wanted to know, you can use the GATES, for example, or you can talk about, the NSF, whichever you would like to talk about, to tell us a little bit about the process. How do you find funding sources? So one of the ways you mentioned was your mentor, but are there other ways that folks can find funding sources if they don't have anyone, who said, hey, you should do this graduate thing, or you should apply to fellowships. And then also what, how much time should I be dedicating to this application process?
Right. Yeah. So now I'm thinking too, and I wasn't clear about this as well. So I'm going to touch on your questions in different parts.
Sure.
There is a little difference between the fellowship and the grant.
Oh yeah.
And so, yeah, typically what I found with grants, and actually now I'm thinking about it, the grants that I've applied for, now I'm thinking about it, have been more, I think, inside of the school. Mm-hmm. And what I've found to be the difference really between the fellowships and the grants is the fellowships provide more of, how can I put it?
type stuff?
Yeah, the fellowships typically have more of the like a PD component to it, if that makes sense. I mean, not all of them do, but they tend to have like that kind of element to it, where there's like a mentoring, or there's like something like there's like more things kind of attached to it. Whereas it seems like the grants typically are like larger, and then the product is like the outcome of whatever you said you were going to do. Like, I got money specifically for this thing, right? And so there's just some subtle differences in terms of, I think, even like applying for a grant versus a fellowship. And if definitely I encourage applying for, fellowships and grants. I just know that there is some differences in that. And when we're thinking about grants too, like there's smaller grants that we've seen happen, like inside of like a school of education or school, or inside of like a graduate school. But there's also like these larger, bigger grants that like NSF or like a Spencer have, or it's like 50, 60,000 plus. And I just want to say that they're typically, I just want to highlight there's differences in applying for both. Typically as a graduate student, we don't get the experience of applying for like those big level grants. We might get the opportunity to apply for some smaller ones, but I say that to say too, if you're able to think about, writing a bigger size grant with your advisor or something like that, I definitely wouldn't like discourage it. I have a colleague who just kind of went through that process too. He wanted to have some grant writing under his belt, and so he was able to apply for something like with his advisor. And so I just wanted to differentiate that and to say like there is a difference, and I'm not saying you shouldn't apply to either or, but I think you should apply for both. But just knowing there's variations to it. Now, to the fellowships, I think the process for me when I'm thinking about applying for fellowships, because typically this is what happens with fellowships. You have like your statement, you have your CV, you have like a plan that you have to do to say, okay, once I get this money, this is what the work will look like over time. And then you have like a lot of letters. For me, when I'm thinking about applying for different fellowships, I like to know what the applicant, like what is involved in it. And then from there, you want to tailor each document, to whatever the goal is of the fellowship. But I think for me, to be honest, one of the subtle things, subtle or maybe not so subtle things that I found to be really important about applying for things is the ability to have relationships with people and the ability to get constant feedback about the documents. And I say the relationship piece because that's not something that's intuitive. And so typically when I've tried to apply for different things, and I don't know if this is true or if it works, I tend to be very political about, who I'm getting to like be like letters. Like I think about, do I have a good relationship with this person? Does this person fit for this particular application? Maybe what is their history with the organization? Like, did they get a Ford Foundation, any type of support? Have they got NSF support? Like, I'm thinking about all of these different things. Can they write me a strong letter of recommendation? What do I want them to speak to about me in relation to this application? I mean, I think the letters to me are super valuable. And in having those letters, it's important to be able to make sure that you have the materials that you can like provide your letter writers to be able to write a strong letter to. I mean, some could say, well, I know if you know the person as well as you think you know them, you might not need that. But I just think it doesn't hurt to have the materials and then do a lot of forward thinking about who am I getting to write this letter? Why am I asking them to write this letter? And, can they write me a strong letter? And is there anything about this particular person that I need them to highlight about a particular application? So I think that's huge. And I think the ability to network and build a relationship with people is, again, something that I think it should be a much bigger deal than what it is. Because at the end of the day, being in an academy, I mean, I think a lot of things are about, your networks. And we just talked about this earlier. And even this whole, the work that you all are doing here, it's like one of the things that's like a hidden curriculum, right? And the art of being in the know and knowing people that know things, and then those people kind of providing you and telling you like along the way, like, look out for this, look out for that. I think the element of having relationships and trying to establish them, is very important. And then the other piece of it, I think it's important to be able to get that constant feedback and have multiple iterations of things. As a person that doesn't always like plan out as far as I would like to, I have found that when I do give myself plenty of time to write things and go through several versions of revisions and having a combination of people inside my field and outside my field reading things just to give it, that nuance and that critical eye that documents and things work a little bit better. But that's typically the process in terms of applying for fellowships in general. And then just like, I think parts that are important when people are thinking about applying for things that, nobody, it's funny. I don't think nobody ever really told me some of this. Or if they have, I just can't remember at the moment, but it's just been some like my pet peeves like over the years that I just try to really rely upon when I'm thinking about applying for different things. Also being able, if possible, to follow up with people. And this goes back to the network, to know people that's already applied for it and won, and kind of getting some of their, expertise about what the process was like, and kind of, building from there is something else too that I think is really important about some of these processes.
Yeah, so thanks, Charles. So one thing I just want to mention that Charles says letters, and what he means is letters of recommendation. When you're applying to grad school, when you're applying to funding, for fellowships, when you're even applying to jobs, you'll need letters of recommendation. So that's something to think about. I think what you mentioned, Charles, which is really important, is like finding those networks along the way, those mentors along the way that know you, know your work ethic and those types of things, where you can say, oh, I'm applying to this graduate program, or I'm applying to this fellowship, and what they know about me would really fit into this application, the thing that they're asking for folks to look like or to be, and so I think that's really, really important. And also what you said about having folks around you who can look at your materials, whether it's someone who've applied before, or just like having mentors or colleagues who can look and say, hey, that sounds kind of funny, or what do you mean by this? Or your grammar, needs some work, girl, whatever it is, having folks look at your application, I think is like super important. So
yeah, and I real quick, and I say that the part about the several iterations is sometimes we're our own worst critics, and it's important. Part of the feedback inside of making the work better is to get it out, because we can get in our own head, and then we procrastinate, or then we lose valuable time because of the mental strains of like trying to apply for some of these big things that we hold on to things maybe a little bit too long. And so also a part of getting constant feedback is to allow yourself the permission to just write stuff, get stuff out, because it's so easy, to get caught up in trying to make this thing so perfect and wait until the last second. But I've actually found when things are like the least, when things make the least sense and I'm constantly getting feedback, that process works out better to make a better overall result.
So you told us a little bit about the differences between fellowships and grants and kind of like the application process for a fellowship. How much time should I be dedicating to filling out these applications? Like, so for example, like I've looked at like, the Ford or the NSF, and I'm like, and I look at the amount of materials you have to produce. And I'm like, okay, in the fall, I need to start this in June so I can apply in November. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, can you tell us a bit about like how much time you spend and like when we should start even just checking it out? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What happened to me was that I'm like, oh, I'll start checking out in the fall, and then it's like September, and then I'm teaching classes, I'm doing this, doing that, and next thing you know, I have no time. The deadline's in 2 weeks, and I'm like, I'm not doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Nah, man, great question, and I echo all of those sentiments. So even before I dive in, one of my other things that I try to do and I tell people to do all the time is, this is also why you constantly apply for stuff. Because if you constantly apply for stuff and I kind of told you generally what the process is, to some degree you already have materials relatively, right? Like, so if you're being you kind of have your CV together, you kind of have a statement, when you're constantly applying for things, you kind of already have a good foundation. So it's not like you're starting from scratch with a lot of these documents. So that's one. And I also say because of that, or because when you're trying to make a big push for applying for one particular fellowship or grant, I tell people at least try to apply for 2, maybe 3, because normally they're all around like the same period. And so if you're already got the materials and done all of that hard work for one, if there's another one that, relatively fit, why not try to apply for that one too? And so that's kind of like what happened a little bit like with the NSF and the Ford, where I think it was like maybe a week or two apart in terms of when they were due. And so I honestly think the NSF was due first and then forward. And so for me, I think actually going through that process of going through NSF held me accountable to be able to apply for forward, but then also made my application for that much stronger, because at that point I had more time to then go through those revisions and think about how I want to craft it, and I wasn't working from scratch. And so I just start there because I think that's also like a very subtle thing that people might, go over your head, or part of the hidden curriculum that I think is very valuable, that I'm not sure, everybody kind of like considers. So now back to the question of how long does it take and when you should start applying. Typically, it depends on the person. I wouldn't say like I'm the most organized person. I tend to just get stuff done. But that being said, I think it's always nice to, if possible, best case. So I'm going to tell you best case scenario, and then we can kind of talk about if it ain't best case scenario. I think in best case scenario, one would know about these positions, a couple months in advance, but also depending on what the position is too. And this is why, and y'all probably have another section about this too, reading like a book like the professor is in is also important, because some of these fellowships you want to be building, you want to be using your graduate school experience to be building in some of the things that you need to know for these fellowships. So what you might be like, what do you mean by that? So typically the fellowships have you thinking about publications, it have you thinking about what's your next goals for future research, it have you thinking about other grants you already applied for. And so what I'm saying is, in years 1, 2, or 3, or even before you get to graduate school, it'd be helpful to be thinking in your mind like, okay, I know I need to apply for a grant. I know I need to get some teaching experience. I know I need to get a publication. Like, be thinking about those and actively trying to like knock those out. Because again, when we're applying with things too, it's about what we're bringing to the table. And so some of this stuff is just a write-up. But the other piece of it is you got to have the substance. You got to actually have the teaching experience. You got to actually already have some of the grants. You got to have some. And so, and I'm thinking about these fellowships too. I'm also thinking about, even before you get to thinking about what the fellowships ask for or whatever, but thinking about how can you be growing and developing and building your CV as a scholar even before some of these things come up. So it's not like when you get to them, you don't feel like you have what you need to really be able to apply for them. Okay, back to best case scenario. Best case scenario, you had a couple months to at least know what's there and what's expected. And, if you have those couple months, maybe you might be able to, I don't know, build something in or add a different skill, take a workshop or something that might fit whatever the thing you're trying to do. After you would have done that, then you probably start thinking about, well, what is the plan to think about, one, who my letter's going to be, and two, how can I go through, one, trying to develop these materials and revising them, and that process of going back and forth between my advisor, my letter writers, along with just people that I want to be looking at my materials. Then as you're like starting to creep up on the actual deadline, it's like, okay, now we need to execute the plan. And in executing the plan, I think the biggest thing is, again, being able to stick to that schedule. I very seldomly have had time to spare when I'm submitting things. But again, I think in the ideal world, it would be nice to not be rushing up to the deadline at, 11:59 or 4:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or, 2:59 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, but to have a little bit of time to, maybe have stuff done, take a break from it, come back to it. Because I think also there's beauty in being able to work really hard on something for a duration of time, but then also being able to take a step back from it and then come back to it with refreshed eyes and figure out and see things that maybe you didn't see before. But I think that's like typically best case scenario. You've had a couple months, you've been able to kind of develop the plan, and then you was able to execute the plan with time to spare on the back end. Now, sometimes, things don't work out that way. And so if you just, and I get it, that's happened to me. Again, depending on network or whatever, sometimes you just don't know. And you definitely experience that with the job market sometimes where, stuff just pop up and then you just got to apply. And so that also happens. And so the other piece that I would say about that too, is that's why I think having some organization is helpful about like, where are my documents, where are my CVs, where are my research statements, where are my personal statements, where are my student evaluation, like all of these different things. Because again, and I don't know, like I said, this information, it varies across, your graduate school experience, but these are not all things that people are actively telling you that you need to do, let alone organize. So I'm saying organize things that you probably haven't even had to do. Nobody told you that you need to have. And so that, I think that organization also kind of helps support you in last minute things too, because you kind of know where stuff is automatically. And then kind of like, if it is last minute, you would take what I said kind of earlier and you would just kind of like, you know, fast forward it a little bit, speed up the process a little bit. But I think that's typically, you know, how does one go about, I think in the best case scenario, and, you know, when the case isn't, you know, as ideal as you would like to apply for different things.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you gave us so much good.
No.
Really?
Wait, I did this like a couple years ago.
Mad info. Okay. So a couple of things that Charles said that I want to point out. One, publications. Publications are basically in academia what you produce in terms of like, after you do your research, you're telling the world like, this is what I've learned about this thing, right? So I'm studying teaching practice, or I'm studying students, or I'm studying like students learning mathematics. Whatever I decide to study, I'm writing an article that gets published in a journal, or could even get published, you know, outside of a journal, but gets published to demonstrate that I am adding new knowledge to the bank of knowledge, you know, in academia. So that's what publications are. And they're pretty important at Research One universities and Research Two universities. I just want to say that again. But if you decide not to apply to a Research One or Research Two, you decide to apply to teaching college and stuff like that, it is still a part of what you're expected to do, but it's not the publish or perish type thing. And we could talk about what publish or perish means also.
Right.
The other thing is that I think teaching experience is really super important, but I'm a teacher, so I'm always gonna say that. But when you're applying to these fellowships, they want to say like, oh, have you taught students? If that's a part of the fellowships, like try to do that early. Like my first year, I was like, as soon as I jumped in, I was like, I want to teach a course, even if I'm just shadowing somebody. So teaching experience might be something that you start out in the beginning, especially if you want to spend the tail part of your time at university doing research, right? You can get that out of the way. And that might even be something that you need to write about when you're applying to fellowships, right? And then the other thing that Charles said, you said so much good stuff. The other thing that Charles said was stepping away and coming back with fresh eyes. I realized that if I know a deadline is like in 3 or 4 months, I'm like, okay, let me schedule out when I'm gonna write this, give this to my friend Laura Ann, get it back, give it to Charles, get it back, give it to my advisor. Okay.
It works like that.
Step back and say, okay, I'm gonna take a break from this and come back, and then you'll be like, oh my gosh, my ideas are coming together, right? Whereas like when you're in the middle of it, it's really hard to see like things gelling, right?
Yep.
So if you get, you know, you look up these fellowships, you realize, oh, I got a few months, take advantage of the time. Because most of the time we trying to rush to a deadline because we only knew 2 weeks in advance, okay?
Okay.
And then the other thing I want to highlight that Charles said was these documents, like your CV, which is a curriculum vitae. It's basically a resume for graduate students and folks in academia. So we have a fancy name for it. But it's basically, these are the things that you've done with your time, okay? A resume for academia, a curriculum vitae, okay? Student evaluation. So you want to really have a bank of those things, like every time you teach a course. Now look, your student evaluations are going to have positive things and negative things. Everybody knows that's going to have that, right? Once you can explain why these things are coming up, or sometimes people can see that they're frivolous, negative things, right? So don't be ashamed if there's like a few dings on your student evaluations, because folks know that that's going to happen. Having a personal statement, having research statements. I didn't realize I really needed that until like I was applying to things and I'm like, oh, they're asking me for this, they're asking me for that. So definitely when you're looking at all these fellowships, look at the kind of documents that they're asking you for, because like Charles said, you might use a similar document for multiple applications. So it's really important to make sure that you have those things organized and you can find them whenever you need them so you can recraft them. So I just want to revoice those things because those are things I was like, oh, I needed to know that before. I wish I knew that before. So I'm going to pass it off to Laura Ann for your next.
Yeah. And I just want to say really quickly, because I think me and you had a similar approach where some of this stuff and the work that y'all doing, it will make these things less invisible, you know, and make them more known. But some of this stuff it's been hit or miss. So everything that I'm telling you, right, I would say it wasn't like that was pushed from the program, like pushed from the advisor. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm reading different things, I kind of, it kind of just worked out well for me. But it wasn't like that was the plan. It wasn't like I was doing, it was literally like I just had genuine curiosity and was around like good people that suggested things and I just followed through. And I say that too, to Ebony's point about teaching, because again, everybody's experience varies. You know, in our program, you don't have to like you don't have to teach a lot. You don't have to design a course, or you can apprentice and you fulfill the requirement to be done. But it's important to know and be active. Like, no, I want to teach. In fact, I want to teach my own course. So it's okay to be able to apprentice a course too. But if you can get experience being like the only person teaching the course, is also very valuable and important. And that, again, that's just some subtle things that people may not know about. And if you can, being able to redesign or design your own course is also like a plus. So again, it's just like these things that it's not like we're saying this, but it wasn't like people was telling Ebony, like, you need to design your course. Or they wasn't saying like, Charles, you need to teach. You know, you need to be teaching like 4 courses or whatever. Like, these are things that we didn't know. And then we were fortunate that we got some of that experience doing. But it's just to say, like, just try to, as we make things more known, definitely do them. But then also, you know who you are. And so if there's things that you already kind of come in knowing you want to do, don't be afraid to like pursue those things. Like, nobody told us that we had to teach or whatever. But for me, I ended up finding out through my prelim, where it's like an application question. And as Ebony and Lauren said earlier, I came right out of undergrad. And so I'm like, oh man, this is a question about syllabi and teaching, but I don't have experience. And so then from there, I'm like, all right, I've been in about maybe 4 or 5 courses since then that's helped the redesign, plan, things of that nature. And so sometimes you can catch it in early enough to where you can kind of plan accordingly. I just wanted to really highlight that point because, again, it's not, people aren't necessarily saying like, do this, do that. It was like happen chance and it kind of worked out.
Agreed.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Thank you. Great points all around. Ebony also with just like clarifying what is a CV? What are these documents? So I know for me personally, like when I had to write my teaching philosophy statement, my research statement, my diversity statement, those types of things. Like there are also resources at the University of Michigan that help me, like the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. Like they have people who are like, they're like part of their job is to read your teaching statement and give you feedback on it.
Right.
Is
Yeah.
Ebony one of those people? And through the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, like there's a professional development program where I wrote, a diversity statement and I sent it and they sent it back to me. They said, you can be more specific here. You can be more specific here. So like, I know I've also reached out like through those avenues, and I have a kind of a follow-up question for both of you, because I know that Charles, you mentioned like some of putting this whole package together is about doing revisions and getting feedback and like working with your peers. Ebony mentioned like, I'm going to give a draft to Laura, I'm going to pass it to Charles, I'm going to get to my advisor. Like, this is how I do this. And so certainly something I wish that I had done more was be both open and discerning in the community of people that are working alongside me. So I was wondering, Charles, Ebony also, how are you thoughtful and selective in finding what your support looks like as you go through this process? Like, what are the qualities and characteristics of people who you're looking like? Are you just like, hello person, read my have you got a few minutes? Or like, how are you choosing who you're sharing that work with? Are they people who are applying in this moment? Because fellowships are competitive. So, how do you reconcile? We're both applying for the Ford Fellowship right now, right? We're both not likely going to get it. We could, but maybe statistically, likelihood, it's not likely. Like, how do we love each other and share each other, support each other, give each other feedback? Like, who are you choosing? People who've done it before, people who there's not reciprocity with, your advisor? How are you making those choices on who you work with?
Before I even tell you like the whole, like, I think my logic behind it, I first want to say, I want to touch on like the human part of it. And that goes back to, again, I keep saying this, and I hope this is something that resonates. And I'm also acknowledging that I'm probably coming from a place of privilege. Is when I'm applying for stuff, I'm genuinely applying for it. I mean, yes, you want to get it, but I value the experience. And so, and I'm also a believer that is what's for you is for you. So if we're applying, if a friend is applying, or I want both of us to, succeed. And it's not like, I'm not going to help that person or vice versa, because you just want everybody to do well and thrive. And I think when you're applying for things, especially like in academia, I think things can be cutthroat. I think it's important first come from a place of like love and come from a place of like orientation and understanding of what I'm applying for, who I am as a person, what does this mean, you know, for me as a person first, and then as a scholar second. And so that helps navigate these, oh, dang, she applying for it, I ain't gonna apply for it. Or dang, you know, Laura Ann Cole, now I'm worried about her, you know, that alleviates all of that, because at the end of the day too, you shooting your shot, and you know, what's yours is yours. And so all you can do is do the best that you can do and move forward and continue to reciprocate that love back. I'm big on reciprocity. So, you know, whatever you give back, you know, you receive, and vice versa. And I'm big on that. So I just want to start there, because I think that can alleviate, you know, some of the things that come up with the more like, who do I ask, when, why, and how do I come to that? So as I said previously, I think for me, it's a couple of different things. And I think some of it is also discipline, being in math education, and I'm trying to contextualize this too, because I want people, when they're hearing us, I want them to also take what we say and then also apply it to their situation. So for me, and thinking about applying for different things, first of all, I came from a math background, and then come to this PhD program, I did more reading and writing than probably I've done, you know, since high school, really, because I came in with credits and things of that nature. So a lot of my undergrad was really a lot of math and science and lab like focus. So for me, it becomes very important, and it's been important in my grad school experience, to really have the writing aspect down, which means that I look for people that are tight in writing, so that can catch errors, that knows the rules of writing and see the different things that I'm doing, and that can provide me feedback. Ebony has done that for me. And I even ask and follow up and be like, yo, I know she made this move here. Why did you make that move? So one aspect of it for me, because of how I am as a writer and me continue to build up that muscle and that skill, is I like to have people that I think are very like skillful, like writers. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is you want to have, I think, people that know your work or relatively know your work, because they can tease apart and see like when they're reading things like, did you really mean this when you said this here? Like, I know when we've had conversations about your work, but I'm not sure that you meant this or your ideas are coming through. So you want to have people that can do that work. And sometimes obviously this could be your advisor, but it also could be colleagues too. So the advisor, I'm thinking of the advisor and colleague role like going interchangeably right now. The other thing that I would say is you want somebody, if possible, to know, you know, the content, or know like you're in your field if possible. So, and that's just good, just like as a check, like, oh, am I citing people I need to be citing? Is there something that I'm missing? Is this really like an idea? Like, am I framing the problem well? Like some of those kind of things, I think is something to also think about. And then it's not necessarily like, I wouldn't say like a person, in order to read whatever I want them to read, they would have had to like apply for it or got the award before. I think there are instances where if you do have that, you could leverage and take advantage of it. Especially if people have won or, you know, or like honorary. I think there's value in that. And of course, I always see value in talking to people that apply for different things and just kind of get in their knowledge, because I think, you know, knowledge is powerful and you can always learn from, you know, others. And so that's typically how I think about, you know, when I'm sharing my work with others in the process of like applying for things, like what I'm like my orientation to it first and foremost that I started with, but then who are some of the people and their skill sets that I'm looking for, and that could be, you know, helpful.
Thank you.
And again, I mean, I think your advisor would come up in some of these, but there's also other people too. I think it's important. That's another thing. I think it's important to establish a community. And by community, I mean that very broadly. Some people's community could be 2 or 3. Some people could be 20. But just really having a community that can, you know, provide what you need when you need it and things like that. So I'm saying community, but I'm saying it in a very like broad way.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to jump off of basically what y'all said. So one, just a point of, you know, academia is small. So folks are going to be applying to the same things. Your friends are going to be applying to the same things you apply for. And what I found, at least in our community, is that 5 of us could be applying to the same thing, and we all are helping each other get these application materials. Because if one of us wins, we all win. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
So at the end of the day, don't feel afraid to apply because one of your good friends is applying. Don't feel afraid to apply because somebody you know who's great is applying. Like, everybody's scholarship is different. Everybody's interests are different. And what they're looking for might be different that year. So you want to make sure that you put yourself in the pot, like Charles says, shoot your shot. The other thing I'd like to say is that you may know folks who applied to a fellowship before, or you may not, or somebody you know may know somebody. So say, hey, you know
Degrees of
someone,
separation.
they got the Ford. Can you connect us via email? Okay.
Yep.
And so
True.
things that I've applied to, they're just like, oh, I know this. I remember Chandra saying I was applying to the Boucher Society.
Honor Society, yep.
Yeah, she was like, oh, the postdoc next door applied to it. Do you want me to introduce you? I'm just like, yeah, I want to know what I need to put in this application. Or, you know, there might be somebody who applied to it 2 years ago or a year ago, and your friend or your advisor or your mentor knows that student or another colleague. Ask them to connect you via email. And don't be afraid. Like, folks in academia are used to people emailing them that they don't know. Like, say like, hey, I read your book, or hey, I enjoyed your work, or hey, I know this person that you know, or having someone connect you that way.
And shoot that follow-up email if they don't respond the first time.
Exactly, because people are busy. So it's nothing like, okay, so if you email somebody and they haven't emailed you in like a week or 2 weeks or whatever, it's not personal. Please don't take it personally. They're literally busy. Okay. So make sure you hit that follow-up email, just like, hey, just checking in. I really wanted to blah, blah, blah. You know what I'm saying? And they'll, you know, most times people get back to you just like, yo, my schedule has been really crazy. This is why I wasn't able to get back to you. But if you don't know anyone who's applied, don't let that hinder you from applying, right? Like Charles was saying, have folks in your community look at your materials. Does this really represent my research? Does it really represent who I am? Or sometimes I have friends say, you know, you do this. How come you didn't say that in this thing? Or you did this, but this is not clearly expressed. And that is helpful. And so I agree. And when I was saying, like, I was like, oh, Laura Ann, look at this, Charles, look at this, like literally. Okay, so this is what I do. Okay, you don't got to do this. But my advisor is really busy, but she always makes time for me. I love her, Chandra. I love you. Okay. But I know that she's busy, so I'm like, I'm going to let 2 other people look at this before I give it to her. So it's like tight when she gets it. So she could just give me the finishing blip, 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 blip. Switch this around, and I'm good to go, right? Because I know that she's working on her own applications, grant applications. I know that she's teaching. I know that, you know what I'm saying, she's just busy. You know, she's mentoring students. She's doing all these things. So I have folks, my friends, look at my stuff first, give me some feedback, so at least it's cleaner when she gets to look at it and she doesn't have to spend as much time giving me feedback. So that's another way to do it. And then I have multiple mentors. So Chandra is like my number one ace boom coon, but I have other folks like Debbie Kaznabis, Dr. Debbie Kaznabis, Dr. Simona Golden, Dr. Deborah Ball, all these folks who are at Michigan who I'm like, hey, I'm applying for this thing. You do teacher education. Can you look at this application? Oh, you do this thing. I'm applying, you know, I'm trying to get into this practice-based program, or I want to talk about practice-based teacher education. Deborah, can you look at this? Right? So also understanding that you want to have multiple people mentoring you. It's not only your advisor, but folks who are doing the work that you're interested in, right? I was interested in simulations. So I found the folks at Michigan who are doing simulations. And then not only are they my colleagues now, but they also are my mentors, and they also have written me numerous letters of recommendation, right? And they're willing to do it too, because once they write that first letter, all they're doing for the next one is like, oh, she did more stuff. Send.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
You know what I'm saying? If it ain't broke. So definitely understand that also your folks are gonna, you know, it's about reciprocity, right? So if you have your friends like looking at your stuff and you know they're busy, they're going to ask you, hey, or if they say, oh man, I'm working on this application, offer and say, hey, you want me to look at that real quick for you? I got some time, you know? So it's a give and take, you know what I mean? Because folks are super busy, but want to support each other, right? And so even like Charles said, you got 2 or 3 people, or you got 20 people, you know what I'm saying? You all can help support each other through this, you know, academic process, but also, you know, applications and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I just added like cherry on top of what y'all said. Added some, you know what I'm saying? Parsley on it.
I'm just add another little bit too to what you said, because you made it when you said, I'm like, oh, that's a great point as well. And it depends, but when you're at different places, you know, everybody's busy. And so if you can think about, you know, just like how I was saying with my letters, like I think carefully about, who's writing this letter, why they writing a letter, what I want them to emphasize. Sometimes with your mentor and advisor's time, you want to do that the same way. Like, I know there's a lot that I need help with, but given their expertise, given their time, like in the case of Evan, what you just said, like, could I put the cleanest thing in front of her so that then it can, as opposed to putting the roughest thing in front of her, does it make, when I say her, I'm referring to her advisor, like which one makes more sense? It might make more sense to try to put the cleanest thing. If you got the conceptual stuff and you got other people that can look at it and build it up, then yeah, it might make more sense to put the cleaner thing in front of your advisor as opposed to something else. But just being aware of kind of trying to do that dance. So obviously you need to be consulting with your advisor, mentoring, figuring out like what's good, what's not, all the process things that we won't get into today. But I just really like that idea of just actively thinking about how can I leverage, the time and being considerate of others and knowing people are busy. Like what can I do on my part to like maximize everyone's, time and space to get what I need, but then also ensuring, the other person, whether it be my mentor or colleagues or whatever, are also getting, out of it what they need to. I just think that's another really, really good point to make that comes up. And again, nobody might not tell you these things, be figuring these things out on your own, but it's just another valuable thing as you're kind of like having these relationships and these conversations to be observing and watching and trying to figure out, how can I best utilize and maximize the time that I have on different things.
All right, so I'm gonna wrap it up with our last question. And Laura,
I hope it's the question I think it is, because I was like, wait, there's one thing I've been holding on to, so we're gonna see.
It is. It's gotta be.
Okay, so
I'm gonna let you know if it is.
So my final question is like, so Charles, you're a master networker. You know what I'm saying? Every time I turn around, you'd be like, oh, I know somebody at that university. Oh, I know da-da-da. Do you know so-and-so? And I'd be like, I don't know nobody, right?
Right.
So my question is for you is, how did your ability to network and build relationships help with applying for funding or other opportunities that you received while you were in graduate school?
Got you. And that wasn't the question, but I'm gonna tie the question in. But the one I'm thinking about, I think is really, really important too, and people don't tell you about that either. But to answer your question, how did the networking come into play with the fellowships? It's so funny. Like, so the whole networking thing for me really came about. I think it was a product of circumstance. I was young, and I was in these different classes, and to some degree, I feel like I wasn't getting what I needed, and so I tried to leverage my interests and what I was experienced to really reach out as opportunity to reach out to other scholars. And so some of that you can say is naiveness or whatever, but I would literally just randomly email, professors who I was reading their work like outside of coursework, and I was interested in ideas, and most of the time they would respond. Sometimes it would be as much of I would use a mutual connection. So if I knew I knew a faculty at Morehouse who knew another faculty at the other place, I might leverage that connection. And sometimes it was literally just, I read this paper and this is amazing. Can we set up a time to meet? Or, I have this data. I've been even doing it, over the course of the pandemic, just randomly reaching out to people. And I think for me, it wasn't like a place of being in Michigan or, because my advisor was legitimately, I just had curiosity. And I was trying to fill like a void and need in terms of having the mentor and the networks. So I just want to say the relationships always started from a place, or I would say for the most part, I always started from a place of like authenticity and just being genuine. It wasn't like I was actually reaching out to people because I needed something from them per se. And then because again, we go back to love and reciprocity, and all people are like, man, that sounds cheesy, but it really is the center of the relationship that I established and build with people. Like that love, that genuinity, that reciprocity, that's important. That's how I established not just relationships with people in the academy, but, my friends and family before I came into this program. And so I do think that that's really powerful. And so once you establish those relationships, some of those could be via email. Some of those are at conferences. I think being at Michigan, we'd be super blessed to really just kind of interact and come across like a lot of great scholars and be in positions to like really meet prominent people and to really establish those relationships. And so once you have those things, then I think the other piece of it is not being afraid to use them. So that's another thing too. Like, you'll be surprised, man. I'm telling you, I recently got an opportunity, and I think I was telling Eldon about this. I had a conversation with somebody. I probably hadn't talked to them in probably legitimately like 4 years. From what I remember, it had been a long time, maybe a couple of years. And, I ended up seeing this person, and that person, played a huge role in recommending me for a position. And so the other piece of it is, no matter how big or small you thought interactions were with people, don't be afraid to continue to follow up and reach out and continue to enhance those relationships, because they matter. And, once you get to that point, I think those networks become important, because then people begin to let you know. So how we talked about earlier, where sometimes, I just found out about a position I didn't know about or whatever. Now, when you have those relationships, sometimes people are reaching out to you to say, well, I know your work, do you want to apply for this, or do you want to do that? Or, you thinking about these different applications, and now you have this network, and like, again, I'm telling you, be strategic about it. Now you might say, who do I know that either got this fellowship or grant, or, they can really speak to something that I feel like I'm lacking. You have these people that you can kind of reach out to and call upon in those moments. And so the whole relationship and networking thing, I think, especially as people, who may be like first generation, or people that just don't know the game and how it goes and works, for me, those relationships and networks have been, critical, and really trying to navigate, the space, of course, including funding, but just navigate the space in general. Because as Ebony said earlier, you don't just have one mentor. You need multiple mentors, because nobody's going to do everything for you. That's just get that out of your head. But it's important to have different people to highlight and support, what you're going through, what you need. That I think that's another very subtle point that people kind of like gloss over, but it's very, very important. And I found that with networking, both in terms of funding and other things, to be really important to have, for sure.
Well, Charles.
Well, the question, and I'll be quick. The question that I thought that happened or didn't happen was, I thought it was going to be what happens once you get the funding, or what happens once you get the grant.
Yeah,
and so that's when I was like, wait, so I'm gonna just be very, very clear about this, because I think this is also a very important point. And if going back to this idea of fellowships and grants, I think fellowships, again, it has the professional development side, and it gives you some flexibility. So when I have something like an NSF or a Ford, what that basically does is it bought out time for me, right? So instead of like having to work on different projects or whatever, the organization said, look, Charles, we believe in your application, believe in what you said. We're buying out your time so you'll be able to do the research that you want to do. That's essentially how it kind of like works out. And you kind of see that too. You probably hear it later on with faculty, how they get their time bought out of like teaching courses or whatever. In some ways, fellowships work in that way. And so I'm coming back to the point of what happens when you get the fellowship, what happens when you get the grants, is I don't want to say it's on your own, but you on your own. And so one of the things that I found once I got them was, now that I had this flexibility, I had to figure out what to do with it. And that's not always intuitive. And so one of the things that I think is very, very, very important to consider when you get these fellowships, aside from what you said you're doing an application, because you're going to have a lot more time in your hands, is you have to figure out how you're going to organize your time. And like on a day-to-day, and especially when you get to the part of your programs where there's no flexibility, you're done with coursework, you're done with preliminary exams, all of that, where it's really just you, the computer, and the desk. Like, you really need to be figuring out what we talked about with those applications. Like, how am I spending my days? How long is it taking me to work on the different tasks? What skills do I need? Because now I'm being bought out. Do I want to spend this time to try to develop myself and just do things like the Rackham workshops or things like that? I'm saying Rackham. Rackham is a graduate school here at the University of Michigan, but it could be anything. Do I want to work and leverage my time to work on other projects? I know one of the things that I was trying to do, and I encourage others to do when I got the fellowship, was to look and see, once you get the fellowship as a graduate student, see who's doing great work at the school, and literally ask, can I just participate in your lab? Can I just do the work? You don't have to pay me. I really genuinely want to know if it's simulations, as Ebony mentioned earlier. Can I meet with you? Do you have a grant for simulation project? You don't have to pay me. I just want to sit in on the meetings and do the work. And maybe we negotiate things like, presentations and papers and things of that nature. And I think that's a very subtle again, these are all things that I feel like if you blink, you missed it, or they can go right over your head, but it can become really valuable when you get these fellowships. Aside from putting it on your CV, we're really using it and leveraging it to try to develop as a scholar. And so some of these things I kind of picked up on like later. But I think, once you get the funding, it's funny. I would say that's where the real work starts. And I know you might be like, man, just getting there, applying and reaching out was hard. But seriously, once you get the funding, that's when the work starts, because now you have the accountability, you have this time, you have this money. And so it's like, well, how can I use it to be my best self, right? And I think that's just another piece that people don't talk about, because at the end of the day, it's not, even though your people wrote the letters, they're not like looking over you to say, are you doing X, Y, and Z? I mean, there is a component where, your advisor has to like kind of sign off depending on the fellowship and say whether or not you're meeting expectations, but that could be very loosely. And so just knowing once you get the grant and the fellowship, what are the skills that you need to do to be successful, trying to figure those things out and trying to take advantage of resources in every capacity. I just gave you one example with the school, but you could also imagine if you was in a place and it wasn't doing the things that you were interested in, reaching out to people at other universities to work on projects, which is also helpful. Because as I said earlier, one of the things that I think about when I'm applying for different things is I want some diversity. We talk about diversity. Let me get some diversity in these letters. I expect people in Michigan to say good things about me, but what will it say if I have a person, in California, or a person in Texas, in addition to the people? Again, those come when we're establishing these, we talk about networking relationship. That's where a lot of that stuff come. And so when I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about funding applications too. I'm also thinking about how are my people, like who am I calling upon? Like, does it stretch wide? Because you want to have different people to be able to speak to the things that you want them to speak to. And I think that's powerful. Like again, everybody, that's one thing. Everybody, no matter what they're applying for, I think it's a common denominator to say the person at your institution should speak highly of you. I'm not to say that you shouldn't get people from your institution to write a letter. That probably would be weird if they didn't. So you definitely should still have people write letters. All I'm saying is, again, once you get the fellowships, this could be an opportunity to leverage relationships with people at other universities that might be doing projects or research that, you might be able to learn something from. And then that's continuing to build out that network too. And again, you're leveraging in this moment. You don't have to pay me. Like, depending on what the fellowship is or whatever. And I'm saying from my experience in the fellowship that I got in terms of the paying and how it worked, like at that point, money isn't the currency. The currency is knowledge, relationships, and experience. And I think that's the thing in graduate school that probably should get even more play, because that's the thing. That's the thing that's going to carry you through. I mean, the money, trying to, living, and I get that piece, but knowledge, experience, and the connections, those are things that I think are critical in the development, beyond just the funding in your development as a scholar, in graduate school. And I just wanted to highlight that piece about what do you do when you get the money. Because it's kind of like when you get drafted. Okay, I got drafted. What I'm doing who am I? You know what I mean? Who's going to be the entourage? Who's going to be the accountant? Like, I think it's just more to be said about just get it like after you apply for the money, but what you do once you get it. Because I think that piece, we already said people are not necessarily talking about this. Well, we're talking about beforehand, but I think the latter part is even more kind of slept on, because once you get the funding, it's kind of like, you're amazing, you're great, okay. I get that, but I still, what do I do with this? Like now, so that was the question.
Yeah. I had it on the sheet. And
Hey, that's why, hey, 3 heads, right? Everybody,
But we just really want to thank you, Charles, for just spending your time with us. Like, you've given us so much, like, I can't even, abundant amount of information that if I did not know this before I entered grad school, like, I have just like, I would have had notes, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Just of all the things that I need to know.
LA, hey, we need to get LA's notes. That's what we need.
But yeah, so I think, folks are going to benefit so much from this. And we really, really appreciate you just hanging out with us and telling us your experience and giving us your wisdom. It really, really is amazing. Thank you.
Man, I appreciate y'all, y'all like y'all family, y'all kinfolk. Just being able to talk about good stuff, good people. This is the easy stuff. This is the humanizing part. So, like I said, what y'all doing is absolutely amazing. I know people will love this and will get a lot from it. And just as much as I've been able to kind of share some of the things that I know, I'm learning just like y'all learning the questions y'all ask. Because another thing too, sometimes we don't stop and reflect about things. And as a person, me, I love asking questions. I think questions are just like the preemptions to everything, and just being able to even sit down and reflect on some of the questions that were raised and really trying to like operationalize like what does this mean and look like is something that I also don't take lightly either. Because not always you see people do amazing things and are experts, but be able to kind of like give you the diagram and the playbook and articulate this is what I was thinking about back then. This is what you should be doing now and contextualize like all of that. I don't assume that either. Because I've actually asked people that, I think are amazing to kind of like chime on different things, and they don't really know, or they can't articulate it in a way that, I can like understand and process and use. And so just the fact to be here and kind of go back and forth and, you share your knowledge and both of y'all share your knowledge and it's kind of like have these questions to really try to say, can we put a name to these things as the title goes? Can we name these things? It's just amazing.
Thank you for joining us for We Need to Name This, a series where we unpack the hidden curriculum of academe. Join us for our next episode, How to Be Strategic with My Time, with Doctors Christina Morton and Amber Willis. For more information, visit www.weneedtonametthis.com.